Good afternoon, and welcome to OpenView's webinar series. My name is Kristen McLeod, and I'm the Senior Digital Marketing Manager here at OpenView. We are a venture capital firm based in Boston that focuses on expansion stage software companies and helping them acquire, retain, and grow the right customers and talent. You can find out more at openviewpartners.com. Joining us today, we have Laurie Richardson, the CEO of Score More Sales, and Liz Kane, the Vice President of Go-to-Market Strategy at OpenView. They'll be discussing ideas and strategies to help companies be more compelling to women considering sales roles, and also give tips for women considering a sales or sales leadership role to help them rise to the top. There's just a couple things that I have before I turn it over to Liz. One, there'll be time for Q&A at the end. As questions come up, please use the chat feature on the left side of your screen. We'll try to get through as many as possible. And then two, we'll send the deck and recording out after this, so please keep an eye out for that. All right, all that said, Liz, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kristen. Just want to make sure I can advance here. So before we dig in, I just want to quickly introduce Laurie Richardson. So as Kristen alluded to, Laurie is the President of Women Sales Pros and also the CEO at Score More Sales, where she helps mid-sized companies grow revenue by solving some of the key issues in the sales department related to recruiting, retention, diversity hiring, process, pipeline, and leadership. Laurie's a close personal friend and a mentor who has consistently been an advocate for women in sales. And when we decided we wanted to do a webinar on this topic, she was a very natural choice. She speaks at CEO groups on the topics of sales growth, and as the president of the Women Sales Pros, she talks to leaders about real ways to identify, hire, and retain great women sellers. This year, Laurie also received an award from the American Association of Inside Sales Professionals for the work she's done promoting women in B2B sales. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laurie, and really our goal today is to share our experiences and discuss approaches to move the needle on bringing women into sales. And I'll take some questions throughout. We want this to be part of a conversation, so please bring the questions in and we'll keep it interactive. Laurie, with that, over to you.
Thank you, Liz. It's really wonderful to be here, and I see we have a lot of great folks on the call today. This is an important leadership topic. It's not a women's topic, and I always like to stress that. When I speak about women in sales, I think about inclusion and not exclusion. So it's really adding seats to the table and not taking them away from anyone. So as an industry, the industry of software technology, which I've been in since the very beginning of my career, we have a shortage of women on sales teams and in leadership. We're going to talk about how the best of intentions doesn't make change happen. We will also talk about ways to get more great women on sales teams. And please note that I say great women, not women at any cost, because not everyone is successful in sales. So it's not just about a body. It's about finding the right people for the roles. We just want to include more women in the discussion. We will do some Q&A, as Liz mentioned. So those of you listening live, please be ready. And I know Liz will share some real-life points as a practitioner and executive in sales. It's funny, Liz, you said I'm a role model. You're a role model to me. So because you're out in the field with your sleeves rolled up. Yeah, you're making things happen. You have a lot of stories. You're someone who's been committed to diversity in your present role and at your previous company. So this is going to be a lot of fun. We've been on some panels together. I have a lot of respect for the way you lead by example. So we'll share some resources, and I want to mention the Twitter handles of Women Sales Pros, and also OpenView Venture. There's a hashtag we always use at Women Sales Pros, which is hashtag Women in Sales. So I think that's a lot to cover, but let's do it. In the past couple years, I've seen and heard a sea change where the leaders of companies and investors tend to be in agreement for the most part. And what they're saying is that they really do want more women in sales. They want to diversify their sales teams. So it's not a matter of proving the case anymore. But for those who may be under a rock or who may have missed some of this, by adding more women to the sales efforts of a company, it pays dividends. And it pays dividends in terms of increased revenues, The sales force is more reflective of who their buyers are, which is really important. There are more styles of communication and problem solving. I have my own personal examples of that, and as well as a lot of other people's. Solid return on investment. And in fact, census.data reported that in the first time in history, women are now more likely than men to have a bachelor's degree, which is kind of interesting. At least half of university grads or more now, it sounds like, are potential candidates for you to look at when you're hiring. So that's a big talent pipeline. And Liz, have you ever had a problem with too small of a talent pipeline?
No, I mean, it's interesting you bring that up, Laurie. I think especially in earlier roles or more junior roles at a company, we're seeing huge amounts and just in great numbers of women applying and trying to get involved. And I think that's also allowing us to filter more women up into the organization, where it starts at the front lines, where if we can bring people in and train them and grow them into more senior roles in the company, it's a great way to address this issue. At NetSuite, when I was hiring lead gen reps and BDRs, we saw, almost exactly a 50-50 split in our applicant pool.
Which is high. That's awesome. That's really great. I wish all of the people I talk to had that experience, because it doesn't happen in a lot of cases, especially in tech. So, but there are reasons, and probably the way you wrote your job description, the way people talked about NetSuite, the way other people referred people, that affected it. I would bet.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and I think because it was a priority for us early on, and we hired a relatively split first class, those referrals started coming in. We had a culture that was diverse and inclusive, to your point. There was never a conversation of how do we get more. It was always fairly even from the get-go. Yeah,
that's awesome. That's really good. And if anyone has a question about some of the results of having more women in sales, there's so many companies now that have done research, McKinsey, CEB, Catalyst, Credit Suisse, MSCI, Peterson Institute, which I'm going to reference in just a minute, and the Cayman Institute, among others. And it seems like there are new things popping up all the time. So the Peterson Institute published research in February. I think this is very interesting. Male-female diversity among senior leaders. Okay, so senior leaders was more of an impact to corporate performance than just diversity at the CEO or board level. That's new. I hadn't heard that before. And it really helps make the case for more women sales leaders. So every week I'm hearing from company leaders, and people are very open to interviewing great female candidates, which I think is fantastic. But before we talk about sales teams, I wanted to share that the average enrollment of women in full-time MBA programs has risen from 32 to 36% from 2011 to 2015. Don't know if you had heard that before, Liz, but it shows an effort that was put together and made, and if it can happen in business school, MBA programs, we can do it in the sales teams of North America. And it starts with a focused effort to recruit women in sales and sales leader roles. And that's something you just mentioned, Liz. It was a leadership. It was a conscious leadership decision. So I think that's really good. You've seen firsthand how gaining more women in sales roles can positively impact a business culture. Correct?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, whether it's with my experience building the team at NetSuite or watching them get promoted into the sales org, or even with our portfolio of companies now. Increased diversity, having different perspectives, different takes even on the same deal are certainly important and allow everybody to grow and have new ideas brought to the table. And I know, Laurie, you and I have kind of talked about that in the past and your personal experience. Maybe we can dive into that later, but that different perspective or just different ideas or approach to a deal can make a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've worked with 3 companies recently that had no women on their sales team. They were either startups or small companies, and in each case, they brought in one or more women, and sales had been climbing. I can't totally attribute it, but I can say that the culture is great there, and they were not just any women that they added. Not everyone has the sales DNA to thrive in a sales role. Not everyone is coachable and trainable. There are criteria that you need to meet to be successful in selling. But when they do, they add to the sales team in very positive ways. And I know OpenView has made some diversity commitments that we're going to be talking about later on. So,
yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a priority for us. I'm excited to share those stats.
Yeah. So we're going to walk through one example of how your company can today improve on diversity hiring and sales. Because it's real easy to throw a bunch of theory around and talk about different things. My goal in the next, in upcoming talks and virtual sessions that I'm doing is try to give real tangible ideas that people can do to improve. We're talking about the company side more today, but this is something that we'll be talking about a little bit later on. And so it's not just doing something, but actually doing the right actions. So in our research, we found that there are 5 competencies that companies can do to improve, and I'll be talking about those. There are also 5 self-competencies that women who are wanting to rise in an organization can work on. We're not going to talk about that so much today, but I will offer a few suggestions at the end. Things like pay equity that companies can put into place. We're not really talking about that today, but we'll give some other examples. As a young woman sales rep, I never negotiated my salary until the second company I was at, after a male colleague of mine shared how much money he made. We had the same job, and he made a lot more than me, and I was the head of a household. So when we hear about things like companies setting pay equity guidelines, or we just had something in the state of Massachusetts, right, Liz, about in interviews, one cannot ask salary.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so I think, if that law passes, it'll go into effect probably sometime next year or even 2018. But that's kind of the first step in the right direction to try to create equity in that cycle.
Yeah, very interesting. So we'll start with a focused effort to identify and recruit great women candidates. That's what I want to cover. One of the things that is helpful, and I know you were involved in this, Liz, in your past and probably where you are now at OpenView, more women role models. You were brought in on interviews, correct, in sales interviews?
Yeah, so probably kind of 2 different topics there, but I think, there's been some really interesting writing done on that about where, if you have a male-dominated culture, often tech, often sales, and you're trying to increase the women that you're bringing in, where do your current women in leadership play a role in that interview process? And so, for example, as a leader in the NetSuite team, I was brought in on a number of interviews as we were trying to recruit and grow the number of women on our broader sales leadership group. And I think it was important to have that perspective, but also I think, to your point, it should be inclusive, and we should be encouraging men to take the lead on this too, not always having to bring a woman in to make that close. We should have a culture that appears inclusive and actually is.
Absolutely. And in addition to that, things in the environment of the company, just like people will go to sites to learn more about your company, they'll ask other people, they'll be referred in. And so the atmosphere that is created, and the fact that we all have some form of unconscious bias to different varying degrees. What we found is that the competencies that companies can focus on, though, are in the recruiting and the retaining of good reps and into leadership, relating within the company, sponsorship, and then working on continuous improvement, that 1% improvement every day. So here's a specific example we're going to talk about, which I think is helpful. Many well-meaning hiring managers have done this and not been successful. So here's how you can improve. Harvard Business Review wrote about this, and several studies were done. If there's only one woman in your candidate pool, there's statistically no chance she'll be hired. Pretty big words. So when there were 2 women or minority candidates in the pool of finalists for a position, the status quo changed to a 50% chance of being hired, which is interesting. When there was 1 woman, it was 0%. And I know you and I have talked about this, Liz. The makeup of the finalist pool makes a difference in who you hire. So if you always add 1 woman to the mix, you're probably more unsuccessful than successful. And I know a ton of companies that have done that over the years. They said, well, we had a woman candidate, but the research is showing that 1 candidate isn't enough.
Absolutely, it's not just it starts at the top of the funnel, right? So if you're bringing 1 candidate in late in the process to an on-site, there's no way to correct that. It has to start with your sourcing efforts and making sure that you're having the right level of phone screens and that you're finding quality candidates early on so that there's a chance that you actually can even out those odds by the time there is an on-site. And I mean, it's interesting. If you have a pool of 4 people and they're evenly split between men and women, it's exactly what you'd expect, that there is a 50% chance that a woman would be hired, right? It's not skewing it in the other direction or creating any sort of unfair advantage. It's creating inequality and a perception of hiring the right person.
Yeah, and since there are as many or more women college grads, this isn't like reverse sexism. This is just getting more qualified people into the pipeline, which I think is really great.
And the rationale behind this is all the rationale behind it is all pretty interesting, right? So if you think about why this actually happens, the idea is that the person that's standing out, the person that differs most from the norm in that kind of lowest tier here where we have 1 woman and 3 men, deviating from the norm can be risky for decision makers. So people tend to ostracize that person that looks different from the group. So for women and minorities, having your differences made salient can lead to inferences of incompetence or that you've done something wrong or are not as qualified when the reality is you're just the minority in a group.
Yeah, it kind of subtly infers things like incompetence perhaps. Why is there only 1 woman? When in fact, that isn't the case at all. But yeah, it's very interesting, and I'd love to hear those listening either live or later on what people's, what people have seen in their companies, because it's fascinating. So I wanted to end my piece with a few things that women reps can do. And, it's a two-sided issue. We're not blaming companies and, they should change the environment. No more, foosball and beer kegs or beer taps. And, it's not all about that. It's a more complex issue. And it's important for women that are setting their sights on advancing in their sales career or who are eyeing sales leadership, because there really are 2 different tracks. I was very successful as a rep for a long time. I didn't want to be a leader. It's not natural. There are not common skills from rep to leader. And so I chose not to be a leader for quite a long time. But those that get into leadership, that is an extremely rewarding career as well. So you have to kind of decide what you want to do. But I think that a few of the pieces of advice that I would offer, and Liz, you might have some to share too, I would say to look for stretch assignments Don't be afraid to fail. If you don't reach out and try something, you're never going to know if you can accomplish it. So I think a lot of times people can hold back and just not put themselves out there so much. Find a sponsor in an organization, and that there's a whole difference and a big discussion we're not going to have today about sponsors and mentors and things like that, but find people who believe in you that can help you to your goals. And it's okay to let your boss know that you want his job someday or her job someday. That's a great thing. So when people can tell what it is that you want to do, when you declare things verbally, I think that can be very helpful. And then just being bold and being brave, stepping up and going for it. What comes to your mind, Liz?
The phrase, just ask. So we've talked about this before, but I think when you're leading a large organization, it's very hard for you to constantly be looking out for each person on your team. So when you talk about finding a sponsor, it doesn't necessarily need to be the most senior leader of your group. It's somebody in your organization or in your company that has your best interest at heart and can advocate on your behalf. And if I think about leading my team at NetSuite, they were individuals that, that I was kind of keeping an eye on, though they weren't in my office, or people who had made an effort to come to me and say, these are my goals, or I want to sit in on a meeting where you're meeting with our CEO or where you're presenting a QBR. I want to learn what your job is, not just get coaching on my current job. And it's probably not something that you as a leader would necessarily think of or would always think of, but if somebody puts it on your radar and can self-advocate or have somebody saying that on their behalf, it's not a ton of effort for you, right? Having somebody join you for a call or join you in the field to meet a customer to learn a new skill set, that concept of just ask applies pretty broadly, and I think that women in particular don't do it enough, making sure that you actually stand up for yourself and say, this is where I need your help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say to leaders in general, if you've identified a woman on your team that maybe she's new, she's in an SDR role or first time in sales, and if she's expressing some frustration or maybe lack of success, I think that women tend to do that more, and men don't necessarily have less frustration. They just don't tend to verbalize it as much. That's something I've noticed because I know that people will say, women need to be more confident. And I don't believe that. I believe that the men that I've helped onboard in a number of companies, about 1,000 reps in the last couple of years, I found tons of young men who were not confident, but they didn't say anything. They just kept doing it. And what I found was managers that were telling me, this person on my team, she's saying, that she doesn't think she can do it. And instead of just moving forward and supporting somebody in that role, if you see talent and you see the potential, keep working with them. Don't write them off. That's my advice to managers. Anything you want to add to that, Liz?
No, I completely agree with you on that.
That's great. Well, let's talk about OpenView for a minute because you guys are doing some neat things.
So, I'm still relatively new to OpenView. I joined in February, and I think one of the more interesting things I saw was this idea that there was a very open and public commitment to bringing more women into business generally. So I shared a quote here. This was actually from a partnership we have with NCWIT, which is the National Center for Women and Information Technology. So tech companies led by women delivered higher revenues using less capital and were more likely to survive the transition from startup to established company. So that's a pretty powerful statement. There's actually another study that was done that talks about a group's collective intelligence. And if you think about that and you put a group of people together, you would think that IQ is the basis of that, right? You take 6 people who have the highest IQs in the room and you put them together and measure the group's collective intelligence and problem-solving abilities. But that was actually not the case, and instead it was the diversity of the group. And as you included more women, the collective intelligence of the group rose. Again, adding that different perspective and a different way to think about things. So At OpenView, we've made some commitments around that, and I think one of the things we look at is that problem starts at the top. And when you talk about recruiting or retaining or creating the right culture, there is a systemic problem that women aren't in many of these leadership roles. So if we actually look at oops, jumped ahead here.
I get my finger up there.
Sorry,
you do it.
I got it, Laurie. Okay.
Okay.
If we look at the S&P 1500, this is actually from the same study that you quoted from the Harvard Business Review earlier. Of all the CEOs in the S&P 1500 across 1,500 companies, only 4.1% are women. That's a pretty tiny number. But as a point of comparison, it's actually 4.5% that are named David and another 5.3% that are named John. So you have 2.5 times the number of CEOs who are men named David and John than total number of CEOs that are women. And that's a pretty crazy stat. So we're working and doing our own part to improve that. And the commitments that we've made are actually being part of a Pacesetters program that sets 2-year goals for both our personal firm and then trying to help and create the same kind of culture for the portfolio of companies we work with. So to that first point, the first thing we're doing is committing to making 50% of potential board seat introductions that are women. So when we have someone in our portfolio looking for an independent board member or replacing somebody on a board directly, we're committing to making those introductions in equal numbers. And that means very proactive efforts on our front to build our relationship of senior women who can take on an advisory role. Right? So we are starting at the top when we talk about building a funnel for recruiting. It works exactly the same way. We're building our network and making sure that we have qualified women and people who can add huge value to these companies ready for introductions in the future. The second thing we're committing to is making sure that 1/3 of all of our on-site interviews are women. Again, starts at the top. So when I look at our group of talent specialists, they're very focused on sourcing in an even way and ensuring that they're making proactive efforts to bring the best people into the top of the funnel so that we can hit those targets. And then finally, we also have the commitment on the technical side. So I highlighted the sales role first, but we also want 25% of our on-site roles for engineers, for developers, front and back end, DevOps to be female as well. And those are not easy numbers for us to hit, right? These are goals that we are working towards over the course of 2 years, and we're making commitments and talking about them actively in our normal firm rhythm, and ensuring that they're top of mind and that we have small goals each quarter so that we can hit these.
That's fantastic. Really great. So we're looking for more questions. If anyone has any questions or comments for us? I saw one about stretch. How do you do a stretch assignment? Can you give an example of that, Liz? When someone says, what's a stretch assignment?
Yes, I've seen that happen in a couple of different ways. So I've personally asked people to step up and do it. And I think the one thing to be really cognizant of is there are plenty of people who are very happy in their roles and don't want to stretch assignments. And you as a leader, if you're proactively giving out those opportunities, need to be very aware of the team that you have in seat. And I think it's very natural for many of us to say, I have this top performer who brings in, their number plus some every month or quarter, and I need 2 more deals this quarter to hit mine. So I'm going to go to that person and be like, come on, Mary, you've got 1 more for me, right? And instead of piling onto that person and making them also take on extra responsibility, it's making sure that you're cognizant of what their goals are and that they want that opportunity. Right? There are plenty of people that are very happy being an individual contributor, making their number, not stepping up and taking on leadership roles. So I think that's the first thing, is to acknowledge kind of who you have on your team and take stock. And then from the other perspective, as you do find those people that want to, either aligning those goals to the goals of the team. So, for example, making the list of kind of your top 10 priorities for the year and saying, who wants to help me tackle one of these, whether it's documentation, assessing a new technology or system, implementing something, bringing on a new process, building out FAQs, teaching a new skill set. I think you'll naturally find people who step up and want to do that, or aligning it to the next role they may want to do. And so I think that's where we see a lot of people kind of assigning out more like team lead responsibility, where a current rep may coach a few of the newer reps, take on some enablement responsibilities, or maybe some reporting or team meetings. Those are kind of the things that come to mind. I don't know if you think of any other examples, Laurie?
It's funny. This isn't a sales example, but it always hits me when I think about stepping up in leadership. When my son was a senior at Northeastern University, he played Division I college hockey. He had 3 college roommates, and one of them became the captain of the hockey team. The other 2 became the alternate captains of the hockey team. He was the 4th guy. He didn't have a role, and people said to me, "Oh, it must be so hard on him," and I didn't know what to make of it. But what I realized one day at a hockey game was that when all the players were coming off the ice, because the Zamboni comes out and resurfaces the ice, the players come off, and my son started standing at the door and just kind of patting all the guys on their helmets with his glove. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Well, then it happened again, and then it happened again, and then it happened again. Game after game, he found a leadership role, and he didn't have a title. So anybody can do that. You can step up in so many different ways in your company to solve a problem or to make something better. And I think that it starts with little things like that. So
that's awesome.
Have you seen, we have some interesting questions about where do we find these great women?
Absolutely. Good. I'm glad you saw it there. I was just going to read that one to you. Perfect. I'll let you take it.
Okay. We have a couple of different ones. What are the best ways to target women in the sales recruiting process? Are there websites, events, organizations that can be used to promote opportunities? I would say yes, and yes. You have to get creative. And I think the biggest thing is to do something different than what you might be doing now. So in the case of one company I worked with, they said that every time they put an ad out for a candidate, for a sales candidate, all they had were male applicants. And in their case, it was rewriting their ad because they had some gender bias in the wording. And there are some very subtle things. I've been learning a lot about this lately, that I was surprised at words that have more of a male bias or a female bias. But it starts with knowing what it is that you're saying to attract people, knowing what it's like in your environment, and then finding enough candidates to fill your pipeline. So I want to say that it's a combination of things. But in terms of creative places for finding candidates, I know you've had a lot of success on college campuses, right, Liz?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe one of the questions is, how does that then translate into leadership or growing people into management roles, or how to find and source those roles as well? I can tell you, I think it's definitely easier right now at kind of frontline manager, next level up roles, and the numbers do dissipate as you get more senior into larger companies. And part of that is probably going to be over time we need to grow that talent, and we need to bring those people into our workforce and organizations and cultures. I promoted a lot of people internally. Like I said, I think that was a great way for us to grow talent and to be sponsors and advocates for people within our organization. But I also hired just as many managers and leaders externally in building my team. And it did take time, and I think you hit the nail on the head. This is not about finding the best female candidate. It's about finding the best candidate, but ensuring that we're looking at kind of equal numbers of people to do that.
Yeah, we just have a bigger pool to choose great people from. That's what's so wonderful. And it can be done. I want to give people that, if we can leave a little bit of inspiration that it is possible. It is out there. There are a lot of things that have been written. Anyone is welcome to contact me directly, Laurie at womensalespros.com, or on Twitter, as we were talking about. There are more and more ideas that are being shared. I know the AAISP, for one example, for the Association for Inside Sales Professionals, they get calls every week for women sales leaders. And And so, get involved with more organizations, and I think it's broadening your connections too. Make some more connections through LinkedIn, through other ways, and just think unconventionally, and that's how a lot of people have broadened their pool of women candidates.
Hey, Laurie, I think we have time for one more question here, but I just wanted to highlight, I think one of the interesting things you just raised was about reaching out to you directly. And I think maybe it would help if you spoke just a bit about Women Sales Pros and some of the work you've done making sure that women are on stage at events, that there are equal numbers of speakers, that we are being very active about that inclusion and diversity, not just in sales teams, but in kind of public settings as well.
Yeah, I'm honored to be connected to Jill Conrath, who started this movement a number of years ago, where she, as well as we saw that a lot of the speakers at business conferences were all male, even though there were a lot of women sales experts. And so Jill made a commitment and made some investment to help change that. We rebranded it as Women Sales Pros last year, and the whole mission now is to help get more young women to at least know about sales, that it's an admirable profession, and that it can be a great career for the right person, and that sales leadership is in need of some great women. And so that's what we do. We interview people, we write about them, and speak at events, and you've been part of that, Liz. So anything to do with, it's a community for people that are in support of that. We hold events, we do all kinds of things. So womensalespros.com is a good place to start.
Fantastic. And I think we just want to highlight here a couple of different resources for folks. So on the slide right now, Women Sales Pros blog, and then also the Women Sales Pros Twitter handle, right?
Yep, we're always tweeting great stuff, and it's very focused on ideas that help in sales as best we can. Yeah. And OpenView, you guys have great content on your blog.
Oh, thank you. I was going to say, if anybody wants to reach out to us directly, please feel free to connect with Laurie or I. Happy to answer additional questions. I know there's a few more here. We can follow up with folks directly as well. But with that, thank you so much, Laurie. Appreciate your making the time. And we'll turn it over to Kristen to close us out.
Thank you, Liz.
Thanks, guys. Liz and Laurie, that was a really interesting discussion, especially for me as someone who's worked with large sales organizations. I'm watching the struggle of people trying to get more females into those roles. It's really helpful to hear some actionable items on ways to do that. So thanks again for that, and I want to thank everybody who came and stuck with us today. I hope you're able to bring some of these tips back to your organization and get more women hired. As mentioned in the beginning, we'll be sending out the deck and recording to you guys, for everybody. And if you have any other questions, please reach out to Liz or Laurie or our community manager, Casey Renner, and she'll get them answered for you. Our next webinar, it will be on September 14th. We'll be talking about remote workforces, so please look forward to that. And at that, that's pretty much it. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.